President Ben Carson.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. I am so delighted to be here in this cold place. We got delayed a little bit because there were headwinds, but I suspect that maybe the airplane didn't want to come to this cold place. But cold place, but people with warm hearts, and we always enjoy being here. My wife would be with me, but she's become such a good campaigner that we're farming her out to other places now. I bet a lot of you probably saw her last week on television talking about the new book, and she's actually my secret weapon. That's working out very well. A lot of people say to me, is it really worth going through all of this? You had a wonderful career, and you could have just retired and put your feet up and enjoyed the rest of your life. And I would say, no, it's not worth it if you're just doing it for yourself. Definitely not worth it under those circumstances. But, my whole career was spent trying to save children, trying to save their lives, give them quality of life. And I personally could not sit down and put my feet up knowing what they're facing. As you've probably heard many times, the current generation is the first generation not expected to do better than their parents. And that's a trend that's just going to continue. And that's the real problem. And that's really the reason that I got into this, because I'm not 100% sure that the political class is ever going to fix this. There are too many connections and just a lot of people who are really more interested in their own careers and in traditional politics of personal destruction. And all these things are what we've seen all of my life. And I'm afraid that we're so close to the edge right now that if we don't do something different, we're not going to make it. Our children and our grandchildren are simply not going to make it. If you look at all the pinnacle nations historically, they all thought that they were going to be there forever. And what happened to them? Same thing. They became enamored of sports, entertainment, lifestyles of the rich and famous, lost their moral compass, became fiscally irresponsible, and they went right down the tubes. And some people say, well, that can't happen to us. Well, I think you can see it's already in the process of happening. The real question is, can we stop it? Is there something different about the United States of America, or are we simply going to be like everybody else? Now, I personally think there is something different. We are the child of every other nation, composed of people from everywhere. And you look at the fact that on our money, it says, in God we trust. The Pledge of our Allegiance. Pledge of Allegiance says we are one nation under God. Many courtrooms on the wall it says, in God we trust. You think about our founding document, the Declaration of Independence. It says we're endowed with certain unalienable rights by our Creator, a.k.a. God. So we have put it out there that we are different, that we are a nation that has a real foundation, a faith-based foundation. And I think the thing that will distinguish us from all those other pinnacle nations, if we're willing to grasp it, is our relationship with God. If we are willing to stand up and claim that relationship, if in fact we are ashamed of it, if we let the secular progressives drive our morals, our values, and our principles out for the sake of political correctness, then we are doomed. So we actually have our own fate within our own hands. It's an uphill struggle because it's much easier to capitulate, to submit, to want to be popular. You know, I remember in high school, you know, when I started high school, I was a straight A student. You know, having been a horrible student earlier, but, you know, through my mother who made me read, you know, I grasped the importance of intellectual development, and I was doing extremely well. But when I got to high school, I ran into the worst thing a young person can run into. It's called peers. Peers. That stands for people who encourage errors, rudeness, and stupidity. And that's exactly what they were doing, you know, telling you what kind of clothes you should be wearing, who you should be hanging out with. And, you know, I got caught up in that stuff. And, you know, I was getting the high fives and the low fives and the pats on the back and doing the Detroit strut. You know, that's a special little walk you do when you turn your head. And you know, I was just cool. But my grades were plummeting. I went from an A student to a B student to a C student. But I didn't care because I was cool. And, you know, my poor mother, she was just devastated. She thought that I was different, that I was wise, that I could see the light, and that I wasn't going to be deceived like everybody else. And there I was, casting my lot in with everybody else. And one night I was complaining to her about not having the fancy clothes. And she said, "Benjamin, I'll tell you what. I'm going to take all the money I earned this week, scrubbing floors, cleaning toilets, doing everything that nobody else wanted to do, and I'm going to give it to you. You take it. You pay the bills. You buy the food. You take care of all necessities. And with all the money left over, you go out and buy all the fancy clothes you want." I said, "Now you're talking." And I sat down, and I started allocating money for the food and the bills. And, of course, I ran out a long time before it came to close. And I realized that my mother, with her third-grade education, was a financial genius to keep any kind of clothes on our back, a roof over our head, and food on the table. And I realized also that I was a fool. And I decided at that moment that I was going to forget about those negative peers. And I went back, became an A student again. And the guys didn't like it, and they were calling me nerd and Poindexter, Uncle Tom, all kinds of things. But I would always shut them up by saying one thing. I said, "Let's see what I'm doing in 20 years, and let's see what you're doing in 20 years. And they must have believed me, because when I graduated from high school, they all voted me most likely to succeed, which means that they knew what was necessary to succeed. They were too lazy and trifling to do it themselves. That negative peer pressure. And sadly, it does not disappear in high school. It continues through life. And it always requires courage to break the effects of that negative peer pressure. And that negative peer pressure is all around us today. It's called different things, like political correctness. You must do it this way. You must say this. And you may not say anything about this lifestyle or whether this is right or wrong, because everything is of equal value. Let me tell you a secret. That is crap. That's what it is. That is just a bunch of garbage. And we need not listen to that. We need not cater to that. Because one of the areas where that will really hurt us severely is in the whole arena of the American way and the American culture. You know, there is such a thing as an American way. You know, there's an American dream. Who else has a dream? Name me another country that has a dream. There is no other country with a dream. People have sought to come here from everywhere. You know, it irritates me when I hear people denigrating the United States and saying how evil we are and we're the cause of all the problems in the world. And yet, look at all the people trying to get in here. You don't see anybody trying to escape. So obviously it's not that bad of a place. But there is an American dream, and we must preserve it. Have you ever thought about how wonderful it is to be able to go from any place in this country, Iowa, Idaho, Maine, New Mexico, Florida, and speak the same language and have the same culture, any kind of climate you want, and still have the same, to have the freedom to move anywhere you want, to do anything you want to do. It really is quite amazing. We take it for granted. But the rest of the world doesn't have that kind of access to such a magnificent array of possibilities. And it's something that we want to preserve. And the reason I bring that up, and some people will say, he's an Islamophobe. I'm not an Islamophobe. I grew up in Detroit. And as you know, I mean, that is the place that has the most, people from Muslim backgrounds. In those days, they used to call them Arabs. That's what everybody called them in Detroit. But, I've played with them. I've gone to school with them, worked with them. Not a problem. If you utilize the Teddy Roosevelt philosophy, which is the philosophy that I have adopted. That is that we are a nation of immigrants, and we welcome anybody from any place in the world, from any nation, race, or religion, if they want to be Americans, if they accept our values and principles and our laws. If they don't, they should stay where they are. That's what I believe. Yeah. And, the left still likes to give me grief about the fact that I don't think that a Muslim who believes in Sharia should be president. But the fact of the matter is, does anyone believe that? When you have a system that allows you to treat women as inferior, people who you think are sexual deviants, you can kill them. People who have a different religion, you can subjugate them to yours. People who belong to your religion, who convert, you can kill them. I mean, there's a whole list of stuff that is not compatible with our Constitution. And there's just no way that we should accept that in any way, shape, or form. And the reason it's so dangerous is because during the Holy Land Foundation trial, 2006-2007 in Texas, looking at the Muslim Brotherhood and some of their connections to radical groups, and also to CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, they were an unindicted co-conspirator in that trial. And many other nations have already named them as terrorist groups. They are in our midst. CARE officials were invited to the State of the Union address. And if you're a reasonable and nice, fair person, you're supposed to be okay with that. I'm a reasonable and a nice person, and I'm not okay with it. Because during that trial, document was uncovered, explanatory memorandum, and it showed what their purpose was: to infiltrate our society and to change it from within, and to destroy our American culture and replace it with theirs. That is very dangerous, and they said it would be easier in America than you might imagine, because the American people would be so concerned about political correctness that they would neglect their own safety. I personally think that we're not that stupid. Many of us are not that stupid. The majority of us are not that stupid. And we can still be reasonable people. We can still be nice people. But we just have to adjust to the situation that we exist in to prevent our destruction. And I think if many of the other pinnacle nations had thought that way, they would have been much better off. You have to be able to focus on the right kinds of things. We have to focus on our values and our principles. You know, I think about the Chinese. And, you know, it took them 1,500 years to build the Great Wall of China. And that was supposed to keep the Mongolians from invading. Well, interestingly, after they finally finished it after all that time, they were invaded 3 times. Not by people going over the wall or under the wall or through the wall, but by people who bribed the gatekeepers. You see, what they needed to be concentrating on is the character of the people, not the wall. And that's something that we need to be concentrating on, again, the character of our people, because it is the character of America that made it into a strong nation. It was our values and principles that made us into strong people. It was our caring and compassion about each other that made us into a successful people. It was not our ability to throw sharp elbows at each other and act like politicians. That's not what made us into a great nation. And I say that as a person who used to throw a lot of sharp elbows. You know, when I was in high school, I was one of the best cappers there was. They call it capping, when you said something to people and really, you know, embarrassed them and made them look bad. Because I was very good at that. Believe me, if I wanted to, in these debates, I could throw some terrible elbows. But to me, that is silly. That's not what we need to be doing. What we need to be doing is addressing the issues that affect the people of America. Why are the people of America concerned? Why are the people of America angry? We need to be looking at those issues. Why do people not have a sense of well-being anymore in a nation that has the kind of resources that we have? I think it's largely because we do not feel that we have a government that we can trust, and we do not have people who are looking out for our interests. It seems like they look out for the interest of everybody else, but they don't seem to be terribly concerned about our interest. And, you know, I am delighted. I'm sure you've heard that the Iranians are going to release our people. That's good. But I was quite disappointed with the way that those prisoners were handled this week, those 10 sailors, and the way that they were humiliated, and the way that our nation was humiliated, when we hold all the cards. I mean, I would have simply said, look, release them immediately and escort them wherever they need to go, or you're not getting a dime. You're not getting any of those billions of dollars. You know? And I would have said, while you're at it, give us back all of our hostages and anything else I wanted. I mean, because believe me, they are totally counting on receiving that money. So I would get all of that stuff back, and then I still might not give it to them. But, you know, the fact of the matter is, you know, we do hold the cards. And what we have to recognize is when we do things like the Iranian deal, What is the effect of that? It's not just that we are giving them billions of dollars to export terrorism around the world. It is that it is damaging our relationships with all the other nations in the Gulf Coast that we have been working with in the past. I mean, what are the people in Bahrain thinking? What are the people in Oman thinking, and Qatar, and Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, and United Arab Emirates, and Egypt, and Jordan? What are they thinking when they see us doing something like this? And then we have the nerve to go to them and say, we want you to join our coalition and be our boots on the ground. Are you kidding me? What would make you think that they would be enthusiastic about joining us? And then they have seen how we treat our allies. They have seen how we turn our back on Israel. Why wouldn't we turn our back on them when the going got rough? That's what they're thinking, and they'll say, well, if we cast our lot with the United States and they turn our back on us, then we face the full brunt of fury from ISIS. So that's why they're playing it kind of cool. And if we were to solidify our relationships with the people who are truly our friends, not only in the Middle East, but throughout Europe and throughout the world, then we would get the kind of influence and the kind of respect that would make it much less likely that we would get into conflicts. Because then when we put sanctions or we did other things, we would get the kind of cooperation that we need. That seems to be something that has been lost, and that affects us mightily. Also, the other thing that becomes incredibly important is we have to build our military up again. We have to have a strong military presence in the world. That's how we keep from getting into wars. When we become weakened the way we are now, with the smallest Navy since 1917, the smallest and oldest Air Force since 1940, sequestration, gutting the personnel, particularly, our lieutenant colonels and captains and majors. And, this is extraordinarily problematic. We have so many of our top generals who have left because they can't work with an administration that tries to micromanage them and has no respect for what they have to say. All of that has hurt us to the point that we have a 14% decrease in the number of people who are applying for our voluntary military service. That is a crisis, because keep in mind, and this is something I want you to remember, between the ages of 17 and 24, 71% of those individuals cannot join the military voluntarily because of physical condition, mental condition, or educational requirements. Think about that. Think about the implications of that. Only 29% of people between those ages can get into the military. That means we have some major work to do in this country. I mean, if we don't fix this problem, we don't need any enemies. We will take care of ourselves very effectively. We have got to get our education to the level where it needs to be, because we only have 330 million people, and we have to compete with China with 1.4 billion people, India with 1.1 billion people. We have to develop all of our people. We can't afford to waste any of them, and our policies have to reflect that. We must once again begin to emphasize physical education. I'm sorry, but we have to have physical education in our schools. We cannot have all these fat, unfit people walking around as children. It's going to hurt us in the long run, big time. And, when we begin to also give children the right kind of environment in which to grow up in, I think that makes a difference also. We no longer emphasize the traditional family with a mother and a father. Now it's like, anything is okay. And the reason that's problematic is you look at, let's just take inner cities. 73% of babies born in the African American community out of wedlock. Now, when that first baby is born, that woman's education usually ends at that point. And that child is 4 times as likely to grow up in poverty. How is that helping our society? How is that improving and strengthening our society? It is not. It is creating dependency in our society. And there are those who say, no, it's very compassionate to take care of people and to make sure that, they don't have to worry about anything. And, we need to make sure we give people all the food stamps they need and, housing subsidies and free health care, and because we're such good people. But is it good to make people dependent? People that God has given talents to so that they can take care of themselves? I think not. And what we really need to be thinking about, for instance, and that's just one instance, there's a lot of different instances, but we need to be thinking about a way that we can take that young woman, encourage her to have that baby, because, Planned Parenthood says we can just kill your baby and that'll solve your problem. Well, Planned Parenthood was started by Margaret Sanger, who was a eugenicist. And she believed that people who looked like me should not exist. And she was a hero in Germany during that time, in Nazi Germany. That's a problem. We need to instead take that young woman, encourage her to have that baby, provide support for her, child care support for her so she can go back and get her GED or her associate's degree or her bachelor's or master's degree, learn to take care of herself, teach her children how to take care of themselves so we can break the cycles of dependency. That's the only way we will ever break these cycles of dependency in our country. And those are things that have to be done by the private sector, not by the government, because we need people in those child care centers who can say to that young woman, you are a valuable person. You have worth. Because in many cases, she's never heard that before, and that's why she's so happy to give herself away to the first guy who comes along and says she's got pretty eyes, impregnates her, and then heads for the hills. When she has that self-esteem, that is less likely to occur. And it is something we all need to be concerned about. That's one simple example. But one of the things that you've heard me say is that I want to get the private sector much more involved in the social issues that affect our society. And that's why with my tax plan, which I hope everybody has read by now, and which I hope everybody knows, everybody says is by far the best tax plan, just in case you haven't heard. Much better. Go to bencarson.com and read about it if you haven't. But it's there for growth. I want a plan that is fair and that encourages massive growth and encourages our economic engine to really get going again. But one of the things that I want to do to get the private sector more involved, there's over $2.1 trillion overseas. And the reason it's not being brought back, American companies don't want to pay the highest corporate tax rate in the developed world. So they leave it over there. I remember many an afternoon sitting around a corporate board table or Costco or Kellogg talking about what we're going to do with these billions of dollars over there. We want to bring them back, but we can't because of that taxation rate. Well, what I recommend is a 6-month hiatus on those taxes and let all that money be repatriated if you bring it back during that 6-month time. The only requirement being that 10% has to be used in enterprise zones and to create jobs for people who are unemployed and on welfare. You want to talk about a stimulus. That would be the biggest economic stimulus since FDR's New Deal, and it wouldn't cost the taxpayers one penny. You know, that's the kind of thing that we need to be talking about. It's very low-hanging fruit, but it also gets corporate America once again thinking about investing in the people around them. And that's what makes the difference. You know, in the early days of America, when communities were separated by hundreds of miles, why were they able to grow and to thrive? Because we cared about each other. If it was harvest time and a farmer was in a tree picking apples and he fell out and broke his leg, everybody else pitched in and harvested his crops. It wasn't an issue. If somebody got killed by a grizzly bear, everybody else took care of their family. You know, it's the way we were. And somehow we've allowed that to leave us. And now we've become enemies because we listen to the purveyors of hate and division who would have us believe that there's a war on women. There's no war on women. There's a war on babies inside of women. There's a big war on them, and that's a war that we have to stop. You know, that's a war that I have fought my entire professional career for. I think I can safely say that I'm the only candidate who's ever operated on a baby in the mother's womb to save its life. And this crap about me operating on fetal tissue, that is just a total blatant lie. But I'm so used to total blatant lies because the left wing in particular, but some of the right wing too, trying to discredit me, but the left wing in particular, they are so frustrated because they can't find a scandal in my life. There are no scandals. I never had time for a scandal. I was too busy. So they have to create doubt. They have to cast aspersions. And of course, everything is disproven that they say, but they never come back and say, oh, we were wrong about that. But, you know, that's just the way it is. I don't worry about that. That's adversity. Believe me, if you can't stand that adversity, how are you going to stand adversity in the White House? Not a problem for me at all. But you just work your way through all that. You do what is fair. You do what is honest. You talk about the things that truly are the things that will salvage this country. You don't get involved in all the peripheral arguments, which the pundits love. They love to get you fighting each other and saying horrible things about each other. I mean, they live and die for that stuff. But that's not the stuff that's going to save our next generation. You know, you look at the debt that we are piling up. 18 and a half, almost $19 trillion. We're putting that on the backs of the next generation. What does that cost them? I mean, if we tried to pay that back, 18 trillion at $10 million a day, it would take over 5,000 years. We're putting that on the backs of our young people. That's unreasonable. And what is the effect that it is having on everybody else? Because that debt is so high, the Fed, the central bank, really cannot allow the interest rates to rise. Because the interest that we pay on that debt right now is $250 billion a year. If interest rates were at a normal rate, 5, 6%, we'd be paying $1 trillion a year in interest. We don't have $1 trillion to pay in interest, and therefore they have to keep it suppressed. Now, some people say, that's great, because that means I can buy a house with a lower rate. Well, that may be true, but you have to look at the negative effects. The negative effect is that part of the American dream just disappeared. Because it used to be part of the American dream that you could retire after working for 30 or 40 years. Because every Friday you went to the bank and you put 5 or 10% of your check into your savings account and you watched it grow over decades, you can't do that anymore. It doesn't grow. So people aren't putting the money in. Same thing with the bond market. The only people who can make any money are people who have risk tolerance, who can use the stock market. That tends to be upper income people, and hence the income gap grows. And Bernie Sanders comes along and says, it's those evil rich people, if we take all their money, we'll be okay. No, we won't. We just have nobody with any money. That doesn't work. That's socialism. That doesn't work. So, we, I think, are smarter than that, and we have to be smarter than that. And we have to recognize that those are the things that are keeping our incomes from going up and that are making us feel bad. We also need to recognize that the amount of regulations are killing us. Last year, we added 81,000 pages of regulations. 81,000 pages. Now, the cost of implementing all these regulations, almost $2 trillion. If we want to break that down per family, for a family of 4, $24,000 a year they have to pay in regulatory costs. Now, it just so happens that the poverty level for a family of 4 is $24,000. If we want to fight poverty, let's get rid of some of all those regulations. I think that was going to make a lot more sense than anything else. And I'm not one of those people who thinks we should get rid of all regulations, but I think we should evaluate them based on their cost and their benefit. So, you look at the president's Clean Power Plan. Now, the EPA has said as we implement every aspect of it, the benefit will be that we will lower the temperature of the Earth by 0.05 degrees Fahrenheit in 85 years. The cost will be billions of dollars and millions of jobs. Does it make any sense? Of course not, because these are regulations that are ideologically driven. What we have to start doing is using facts, using evidence. That's how you really make good decisions. I remember, early in my career, I got a lot of grief because I was advocating a new operation for achondroplasts. Achondroplasts, most common form of dwarfism. 7% of them would die in infancy because their brainstem was being compressed by complex bony formations at the base of the skull. And when surgeons would go in and try to decompress it, was so tight that frequently the patient would die or be in worse shape. And when I started advocating this new method, there was just a firestorm. People were complaining to the president of the hospital, Johns Hopkins, and the dean, and the Maryland Medical Society, even the AMA. Carson's a madman. You got to stop him. But by that time, I had done enough cases, I could actually reveal the data, the evidence. And not a single one of the patients had died. And now it's a standard procedure because in medicine and science, evidence actually counts, not so much in politics. But that that is something that can be changed. You begin to make those decisions based on real facts, based on the intellect. That's the reason that God gave us these sophisticated brains, so that we didn't have to be manipulated by pundits and people who think that they can tell us who we are and how we're supposed to do things. And I believe that that is where we are right now. We're on the precipice. We the people, against them the government, them the pundits, them the people who tell you who you're supposed to like, how you're supposed to do things. The decision in terms of what happens to America lies with us. And that's why I ask for your support. I ask you to go to our website, bencarson.com. I ask you to read what's on that website. Read about our values and read about our principles and see for yourself. Because the fact of the matter is there are none of our problems that can't be resolved with the application of common sense and removal of ego and politics. And we have to do things that are about we the people, not about they, the establishment. And I don't blame them for not liking me. I wouldn't like me either if I were them, because I don't believe in them. I don't believe in their structures. That's one of the reasons that I don't take money from special interest groups and billionaires who want to influence me. I will not do it, no matter what. You know? Because what has to be done to turn this country around does not involve the political establishment. And they do not like it, and they have always had control, and they want to maintain control. And if I'm there, they will not have control. It's the same reason that they hated Sarah Palin so much. Because, you know, in Alaska, you know, she put people in jail, Democrats and Republicans. You bring somebody like that into Washington, D.C., and it'll be a ghost town. So, but, you know, and I'm going to take a few questions, but, you know, it was Thomas Jefferson who put it best. He said we would reach this point in our country where people would not be paying attention. They would be more concerned about the football game or who's on Dancing with the Stars. He didn't use those examples, but, you know, he said we would not be vigilant. And as a result, the government would do what governments always do. They grow, they metastasize, they infiltrate, and they dominate the people. But he said he believed that the people of America, just before we turned into something else, would awaken and would recognize what was going on and would stand up and would regain control. I say it's time for we the people to do that. Thank you. But I would go much further than that. You know, we have tens of thousands of federal employees that retire each year. Don't replace them. You can shift people around for critical positions to cover them, but don't keep hiring people. And then, of those 645 agencies and sub-agencies, I would bring in the chief of each one of them, and I would say, cut your budget by 2 to 3%, or hand in your resignation. And I would say you must cut it in a way that the people will not even notice it, which would be very different than what the current administration did a few years ago with the sequestration. They said, cut it in a way that the people feel it the most, so that nobody will be asking for further cuts. And it should be done in just the opposite way. And in terms of efficiency, our country owns more than $150 trillion in assets. Now, you give a well-run company $150 trillion in assets, the return on that, even if it's only 2%, would wipe out the deficits that we have. We need to run our country like a business. And that's something that I learned in my 18 years on the board of Kellogg and 16 years on the board of Costco. How to run things in an efficient manner. The American people deserve to have a government that is efficient and a government that is trustworthy. And believe me, it is going to be a mammoth task to transfer our government from what it is to that, but it's a fight I'm willing to take on.
I would like to know what President Carson would do in his first 100 days in office.
What are the major things that you would do in the first 100 days in office? Well, for one thing, I would call a joint session of Congress, and I would make sure that they understand that we work for the people don't work for us. We would change that immediately. All of these executive orders we would review, and I believe we would get rid of the vast majority of them. And all the regulations, I would have them evaluated based on cost versus benefit. And if the benefit does not justify the cost, then we will either alter them significantly or get rid of them. I think those are the kinds of things that would jumpstart. I think also I would push very hard to get major tax reform done immediately. You have to do that early on. And the other thing that I would do is reestablish real communication with Congress. The current administration doesn't have communication with Congress. And I would open our communications to the people, because we work for the people, so they should be able to see what we're talking about. And they should be able to see who has their back and who is a stick in the mud, so they can get rid of people who aren't doing their job. One last question. Yes.
This is when you said.
Dan Freiberger, and I've got a question on Social Security. Democrats started Social Security, they forced it on us, then they stole our money. After telling us it couldn't be used for other purposes, now they tell us it's an entitlement. And we paid for it to start with, it's our money.
Absolutely.
And they tell us it's running out of money. What will you do to protect us from them?
Okay, well, first of all, I have to correct something you said. It's not just the Democrats. The Republicans are pretty awful too. And, I was an independent for a long time. But when I decided to run for president, I had to run as either a Democrat or a Republican. I couldn't run as a Democrat because they believe in killing babies, and they believe in changing the definition of everything, and they don't believe, the biblical definitions of things. So there was no way I could do that. Republicans are not pure, okay? But they have a much closer chance of being pure than the Democrats do. No question about that. Now, when Social Security was initiated, the average age of death was 63. Now it's almost 80, and we haven't made the appropriate adjustments. Social Security was never supposed to be what you retired on. It was supposed to be supplemental income, sort of a safety net. We have gotten away from that. So one of the things that I'm going to emphasize is driving down the national debt. And there are a number of ways that we can do that pretty quickly, so that people can once again begin to build up their savings accounts. And they can use bonds, and they can begin to accumulate. Well, see, it's something that we haven't had for such a long time. People have actually forgotten about that and how it's done. The other thing is, I think we're going to have to gradually adjust Social Security for people who are under the age of 50. We wouldn't adjust it for anybody who's over the age of 50. But for people under the age of 50, we have to very gradually start raising it. It'll take about 35 years, but in about 35 years, it should reach age 70 instead of 65. That can be done with very little filling. And then for people who are under the age of 30, we should allow a very different type of program. They'll be able to direct where the investments go. They won't be able to take money out of it. But it will really, that will actually provide something they can actually retire on, not just a supplement. But it has to start that far down. But we just have to be able to look down the pike, and we have to plan. That's why we have these sophisticated brains. If you look at a human brain versus an animal brain, the difference is we have these big frontal lobes. That's where you do rational thought processing. you extract information from the past and the present, and you integrate it and project it into a plan for the future. Whereas animals don't need that because they just react. So the part of their brain, the midbrain and the limbic and all those things tend to be much more developed than ours is because they're reactionary. We need to start acting like people and not like animals. Don't just react to what's going on, but actually plan and strategize. We have the capability of doing it, and if we do it, I have no doubt whatsoever that this nation will be soaring in absolutely no time, far above what anybody else is doing, and God will bless us again once we put him where he needs to be. Thank you so much.
Yes,
How'd
Dr.
you
Carson.
get to be first?
Kate Hayden with the Charles City Press. That's
Okay.
just what we do.
Okay.
Recent poll with the Des Moines Register and Bloomberg put your supporters as the top 3 most determined caucus goers. You're right behind Trump and Cruz. How well do you need to do in the polls? Do you need to pull ahead of either two of them?
I would love to
replace
pull ahead of them,
Cruz?
and you know that's why we're spending time.
But how well do you need to do in order to remain a GOP priority?
I don't know. All I know is that we're going to do as good as we can possibly do. That's the key.
Do you think you'll be able to retain evangelical vote above Trump or above Cruz?
I always say, never guess when soon you'll know. And obviously, what we're going to do is just what we're doing here. Talking to people, letting them get a chance to see who we really are. Not who the press says we are, but who we really are. That changes a lot of minds.
It's very interesting. You brought up in today all of your topics were a lot different from any of the other town hall meetings that I've been to. You brought up the private sector and stuff like that. I wanted to focus on the private sector first. Talk to me a little bit about why you find it so important to bring this up and how you plan on doing that.
Because one of the reasons that the government has mushroomed the way it has is because it's taken on a lot of the responsibilities that used to be the private sector responsibilities. And it's relationships that actually solve our problems. It's not bureaucracies that solve our problems. So, you know, that is a very important part of what a Carson administration would push for.
How do you do it? How do you fix this?
Well, I gave you one example, you know, with the tax code. And also, the government can work very well to coordinate the efforts of different groups. So, for instance, the group that is helping young women who are pregnant with the support of that pregnancy can coordinate that with groups who are supplying child care so that she can go ahead and get her GED. So the government is excellent at doing that kind of thing without itself creating the bureaucracy.
One of the things that you brought up today was that private sector getting involved with single mothers who happen to get pregnant. What does that look like, the private sector getting involved in that situation?
Well, that's something that I'm very familiar with because, you know, before I got involved in the campaign, I did a lot of public speaking involved with a lot of those private sector groups who are having just tremendous success. And it's just people who care about other people. You'd be amazed at how much of that actually occurs in our society.
So can you expand on what that looks like
They're
then?
all over the place. I bet you got some right here in this city. There are people who feel a calling. They get together, they get local sponsors, and you know they buy property, and they actually help to take care of these people.
Okay. You believe that physical education is important in schools, yet you say homeschooling is the best form of education for students. How do you plan to regulate homeschools to do anything?
I don't plan on regulating homeschools. That's the whole point of having homeschools, so that they won't be regulated by a bunch of bureaucrats. But I've had an opportunity to talk to a lot of the homeschooling groups, and you know, I don't think it's much of a problem. You know, they're getting lots of physical activity for their kids, and you know, they have groups where they work together with other groups to make sure that they get all the things that you would get in public schooling and more. It's not a problem.
Dr. Carson, the release of the 4 American prisoners today will rightly be celebrated. You were very pleased in the statement you released today, but do you believe that this raises questions over, whether the Obama administration has given America's enemies an incentive to imprison or take American hostages? U.S. officials have said that they acknowledge that the Iranian government did get something in return for the swap.
Well, let me just put it this way. In a Carson administration, people would be very reluctant to take our people. Let me just put it that way. There may be a few who do it in the beginning. There won't be any after they see what we do.
And they won't want to take our people hostage.
They will not want to take
Why?
our people because it will cost them tremendously.
And you will make sure that they know that?
Absolutely, they will know that. It will not take very long for people to understand that you don't mess with America.
Thanks, guys.
Okay.